Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on a topic that's super relevant to, well, pretty much everyone, Africa's role in a rapidly changing world.
And we've got a fantastic resource to guide us today.
Right. We're diving into the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report 2025.
It's packed with insights, really gets into the nitty-gritty of the risks and opportunities all over the globe.
But for this deep dive, we're zeroing in on Africa.
It's a fascinating region to explore because, well, it's facing a whole bunch of unique challenges, but also some pretty incredible opportunities.
Exactly. Our mission today is to give you a solid understanding of those challenges and opportunities, how they connect to the bigger global picture.
Because let's be real, what happens in Africa affects us all.
So true. And this report doesn't sugarcoat things. It dives right into some pretty serious challenges.
It paints a pretty stark picture, yeah.
First up, humanitarian crises.
We're seeing these ongoing crises in Sudan, Mali, Haiti, and the report makes it clear those situations could easily get worse.
And when they do, they destabilize entire regions.
Right. Think about the conflict in Sudan. It's already causing huge problems with food security, not just in Sudan itself, but in neighboring countries too.
Ethiopia, South Sudan, even as far as Chad and Egypt, it's all connected.
It really highlights the ripple effect, how one country's crisis can quickly become a regional issue, even a global one.
And speaking of food security, the report flags another big risk. A lot of cities in sub-Saharan Africa, they're heavily reliant on global food markets.
Yeah, and that makes them incredibly vulnerable. Any disruption to those markets, conflict, climate change, economic instability, it all hits them hard.
Like putting all their eggs in one very fragile basket.
Exactly.
And on top of that, we've got this global economic slowdown happening.
Right, and the report singles this out as a major risk for a lot of African nations. In Kenya, for instance, it's the top concern for business leaders.
So what might seem like a distant economic trend in another part of the world can have a very real impact on people's lives in places like Nairobi.
Absolutely. Global economic slowdown often translates to less investment in developing countries. That means job losses, stalled infrastructure projects, slower economic growth overall.
It just makes those existing problems like poverty and inequality even worse.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
And then you add on this other massive challenge, the lack of economic opportunity, especially for young people.
72% of young adults in sub-Saharan Africa are stuck in insecure employment. That's a recipe for instability.
It's a staggering statistic. When so many young people lack opportunities, you get this sense of frustration, disillusionment, and it can easily boil over into social unrest.
Absolutely. It creates all sorts of societal problems, and breaking that cycle is really tough.
So we've got humanitarian crises, food insecurity, economic instability, lack of opportunities. It's a lot.
And the report keeps going. Pollution, particularly in those densely populated urban areas, is also flagged as a critical challenge.
It makes sense. As these cities grow and industrialize, pollution becomes a bigger and bigger problem.
Right. With consequences for public health, the environment, it's a growing concern.
So now we're adding environmental concerns to the list. And then there's involuntary migration.
With so many people displaced globally, it's putting a huge strain on a lot of African countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees.
It's this complex balancing act, right? Providing refuge for those fleeing conflict, but also making sure the host communities have the resources they need.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a humanitarian imperative to offer refuge, but it requires careful planning and a lot of support from the international community.
Absolutely. Because it's not just about providing food and shelter. It's about ensuring that both refugees and host communities can thrive, that there aren't tensions over jobs and resources.
Exactly. It's a delicate situation.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. The report also highlights geopolitical instability as a major concern, particularly state-based armed conflicts.
And it emphasizes something really important. These conflicts are rarely isolated events. They're often linked to those other risks we've been talking about. Economic inequality, social polarization, competition for resources, it's all interconnected.
It's like we're peeling back layers of complexity here.
Okay.
And the report suggests that weakening multilateralism is making a lot of these problems even worse.
Right. There's this concerning trend, a decline in trust in those big international institutions like the UN, and that can translate to less funding for crucial international aid organizations. It makes it harder to coordinate a global response.
So it's like we're losing the very tools we need to address these problems effectively. And then on top of all of that, we're entering this era of rapid technological advancement. Technology is a double-edged sword, right? Opportunities and risks.
Absolutely. The report points out that emerging economies, those in Africa included, could be especially vulnerable to some of those technological risks. Cybersecurity threats, lack of robust regulatory frameworks, these are serious concerns.
So we need to be mindful of how we're deploying these technologies, making sure they're used ethically responsibly.
Couldn't agree more.
It's a lot to take in. It feels like Africa is facing this perfect storm of interconnected challenges.
It's a sobering picture, that's for sure. But it's important to remember the report doesn't just focus on the negative.
Oh, good, because I was starting to feel a little overwhelmed. So tell me, what are some of those bright spots? What opportunities does the report highlight?
Well, for one, there's the potential for regional organizations like the African Union to play a much bigger role in addressing these challenges.
The African Union. I've heard of them, but to be honest, I don't really know what they do. Fill me in.
Think of them like the UN, but specifically for Africa. They have this deep understanding of the continent's complexities and are uniquely positioned to mediate disputes, promote cooperation, even lead peacekeeping efforts.
So empowering the African Union, giving them more resources and support, could be a key part of the solution.
Absolutely. Recognizing and supporting African leadership in solving African problems, that's a big part of it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
What else? What other opportunities does the report highlight?
Well, another big one is Africa's demographics. A lot of sub-Saharan African countries have incredibly young populations.
So instead of viewing this as a problem, we should be seeing all these young people as a potential asset.
Precisely. This youthful population represents a massive potential workforce. But, and this is a big but, that potential can only be realized if there are enough jobs and if we invest in education and skills development.
So it's not just about having a large workforce. It's about having a skilled workforce, one that can contribute to economic growth.
Exactly. And that's where strategic relationships come into play.
Strategic relationships. Tell me more about that.
Well, we have to remember Africa isn't isolated. It has the opportunity to build partnerships with countries all over the world. And those partnerships, if done right, can help address a lot of the challenges we've been discussing.
So we're talking about collaborations that go beyond those traditional models of aid.
Exactly. Partnerships built on resource sharing, technology transfer, infrastructure development, knowledge exchange. It's about mutual benefit, where everyone wins.
Okay, now we're talking. This is starting to sound more hopeful, but let's be realistic. These challenges are massive. What concrete steps can actually be taken to make a difference?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And thankfully, the report doesn't just lay out the problems, it also offers some specific strategies for building a brighter future.
All right, I'm ready. What's the plan? What can be done to address these challenges and really capitalize on those opportunities?
Well, the report lays out a whole roadmap, a bunch of specific strategies to tackle these issues. And I think maybe the most important one, it really stresses the need to strengthen multilateralism. We were just talking about that decline in trust in those big international institutions, the UN and others. And the report is saying, we got to reverse that trend.
So less every nation for itself, more we're all in this together.
Exactly. Because when you think about it, those big global challenges, climate change, pandemics, economic instability, they don't care about borders, right? We need a unified approach. And that also means taking a hard look at some of those institutions themselves.
Like reforming the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
Making sure it's actually representative of the global community.
Right. Is it inclusive? Does it have legitimacy? Those are key questions.
Makes total sense. So strengthening multilateralism. What else? What are some other strategies?
Well, empowering regional organizations is a big one. Like we talked about the African Union earlier, and they really have the potential to be a driving force in addressing some of these challenges.
Yeah, they have that on-the-ground understanding that those big international organizations sometimes lack.
Exactly. So the report suggests investing in their capacity, bolstering their peacekeeping capabilities, supporting their mediation efforts, giving them the resources they need to really take ownership of these issues.
So less outside intervention, more trust in those regional actors to kind of take the lead on issues closer to home.
Right. And another big one, we talked about global supply chains being vulnerable, and the report dives into that too. It's saying we need to diversify those supply chains, spread the risk.
Right. Like we saw with the pandemic, one disruption and the whole system goes haywire.
Exactly. So, businesses, governments, they need to step back, really assess the risks, particularly those tied to partners who might be operating in conflict zones or unstable regions.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Diversification is key to building resilience.
Makes a lot of sense. What about some of those other big challenges, like we talked about Africa's young population, this huge potential workforce, but also that need for investment in education and skills?
That's the human capital piece of the puzzle. And the report emphasizes just how crucial that is. It's not just about having bodies to fill jobs, it's about making sure those young people have the education, the training, the skills they need to thrive in the 21st century.
Right, investing in people, not just infrastructure. Right.
Exactly. And that means, putting serious resources into education, vocational training, infrastructure development. That's how you unlock that demographic dividend and drive real economic growth.
So a long-term strategy. What about the environmental challenges? Pollution, in particular. The report mentioned that as a major concern.
Yeah, and the report's pretty clear about that. If you want to tackle pollution, you need better monitoring, better evaluation systems. You got to be able to identify those emerging pollutants, get ahead of the curve.
So really understanding the problem before you can effectively solve it.
Right. It's about targeted solutions.
Makes sense. And of course, a lot of this comes back to, like we talked about, those strategic partnerships, international collaboration.
Absolutely. I mean, think about the potential for collaborations in areas like renewable energy, healthcare innovation, sustainable agriculture. There's so much opportunity there.
A lot of potential for win-win partnerships, it sounds like.
Exactly. And, one other area the report highlights, and it's something we touched on earlier, is the whole digital space. We talked about the risks, but there are also, massive opportunities there.
Yeah, if people are equipped to navigate the digital world safely and responsibly.
Exactly. So the report talks about things like digital literacy programs, public awareness campaigns, educating people about the opportunities, and also the risks of the online world.
Empowering people.
Right. And then one final point the report highlights is biotechnology. It's this field with huge potential benefits, but, there are also some serious ethical considerations. So the report's suggesting that we need to start thinking about international ethical guidelines, oversight for biotech advancements.
Thinking about those ethical implications before things become widespread.
Exactly. Having those conversations now could save us a lot of trouble down the road.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from
Yeah.
conflict to climate change to, the digital revolution and biotechnology. It's a lot.
It's complex, no doubt. But I think the report does a good job of not just outlining those challenges, but also, giving us a path forward.
So if we had to distill all of this, what would be the key takeaway for our listeners? What's the most important thing to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that interconnectedness. None of these challenges are happening in isolation. They're all linked, both within Africa and globally.
So it's not just about Africa finding its own solutions. It's about recognizing that these are global challenges that require a global response.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key point the report makes. Multilateral cooperation is absolutely essential. We've seen that decline in trust in those big international institutions, but the report argues that we need to turn that around.
Work together, share resources, find solutions that benefit everyone.
Right. And that means, moving away from those short-sighted, self-interested policies, really embracing a more collaborative, long-term approach, one that puts people and the planet first.
Thinking about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that leads us to a final thought for our listeners. When you look at the systems we have in place to deal with global issues, are they really up to the task? The report suggests they're not. If we want a better future for Africa and the world, a future that's more sustainable, more equitable, we can't just sit back and watch.
It's a call to action then. Not just for governments and those big organizations, but for individuals too.
Absolutely. Every action counts. Whether you're an entrepreneur looking to invest in sustainable solutions, an activist pushing for policy changes, or just a concerned citizen making informed choices in your daily life, it all makes a difference.
So what can our listeners do? Where should they start?
Start by staying informed. Keep learning about these issues, asking questions, challenging the status quo. Engage with your community. Support organizations that are working to make a difference.
Use your voice.
Exactly. The future depends on engaged citizens like you.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Africa's challenges and opportunities. It's a complex landscape, no doubt, but it's also a region full of incredible potential.
We've only scratched the surface here, but hopefully this conversation has sparked your curiosity.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for positive change. The future of Africa, and indeed the world, depends on it.
I couldn't agree more.
Thanks again for listening.